Millionaire gives $100 to a maid. The next day, he sees her at his lover's grave from 15 years ago. 15 years ago, Alexander Ward lost the love of his life under mysterious circumstances he's never fully understood. Now, a wealthy hotel tycoon in Los Angeles, he's grown used to his solitary existence, quietly guarding the memories of his past. But one unremarkable afternoon, a single act of generosity, handing a maid $100, will send him spiraling into an uncanny confrontation with the tragedy he thought he'd buried long ago. The next day, Alexander sees that same maid visiting his lover's grave, the grave of the woman who disappeared from his world a decade and a half ago. What unearthly twist of fate has brought them together? Alexander Ward stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse suite at the Ritz-Carlton in downtown Los Angeles. The city sprawled beneath him, a glowing sea of concrete and neon, as dusk gently settled across the skyline. He was a man of wealth, power, and refined taste, yet behind his poised exterior lay a sorrow he carried silently for years. Some said Alexander's eyes held a shadow that never quite lifted. Those close enough to notice rarely dared to question him about it. He'd built a real estate empire over the past decade, devoting himself to unrelenting work. Luxury hotels, upscale condominiums, entire neighborhoods of sleek high-rises bearing the Ward name dotted major cities around the world. On the surface, it was an inspiring success story of a small-town boy from California who'd made it big, but those who truly knew him understood the impetus behind his drive. Heartbreak. 15 years ago, he'd been a wide-eyed dreamer at the University of California, Berkeley. He studied business administration and poured his energy into the campus's entrepreneurial community. But none of that mattered once he met Rebecca Holloway, a brilliant architecture student who sang in the school's jazz ensemble on weekends. Alexander had fallen for her swiftly, entranced by her soulful eyes and fierce intelligence. They planned a life together after graduation, a life he believed was marked by destiny itself. Yet fate played a cruel hand. In the final semester of her studies, Rebecca vanished without explanation. A few cryptic notes, rumors of family conflicts, and then she was gone. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months, and eventually months into years. The police found no trace. Friends theorized she must have traveled abroad or disappeared under duress. At first, Alexander refused to give up hope. He hired private investigators, posted online pleas for information, and clung to the shred of possibility that she was still alive. Then, 5 years later, he received the news that shattered him completely. Rebecca's body had been discovered in a remote wooded area near Big Sur. The circumstances around her death remained murky. The authorities listed it officially as an unresolved case. Distraught, Alexander buried himself in his work. He founded Ward Enterprises, chasing success to obliterate the agony in his chest. In time, that grief turned into the quiet steeliness that propelled him up the business ladder. And yet, every year on the anniversary of her disappearance, Alexander visited her grave, one of the few forms of closure he had. Buried in a small, serene cemetery on the outskirts of Los Angeles, Rebecca's resting place was a secret he guarded. He only trusted a few confidants with the knowledge of its location, determined to keep her memory untainted by publicity. Now, gazing down at Los Angeles, Alexander caught his reflection in the glass. His dark hair was neatly combed, his emerald eyes more solemn than youthful, lines of experience etched around them. His phone buzzed, jarring him from recollections. "Mr. Ward, your car is ready," came the voice of his personal assistant, Catherine Morgan, through the speaker. Alexander let out a quiet sigh. "Thank you, Catherine. I'll be down shortly." He threw on his tailored blazer, grabbing a small sealed envelope from the bedside table. For reasons he couldn't entirely explain, he felt a twinge of nervousness that evening. Perhaps it was the date. It would be 15 years to the day next week since he last saw Rebecca alive. As he stepped out of the penthouse, he tried to shrug off the melancholic weight. In the lobby, he passed uniformed staff that greeted him politely. He returned a curt nod and strode toward the private exit. That was when something caught his eye. A young maid, leaning against the wall with a tired expression, rummaging in her pocket for something. As he passed, she inadvertently dropped what looked like her own tip money. Bills fluttered across the marble floor. She hurriedly bent to pick them up, eyes darting in embarrassment. "Here, let me help," Alexander offered, stooping to retrieve a stray $5 bill. The woman's eyes were wide, as though she recognized him from the countless magazine covers or internal staff memos of the global company. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't see you coming," she stammered. Alexander extended the bill with a faint smile. "No need to apologize." She thanked him, but her voice trembled. There was unmistakable gratitude, laced with a hint of desperation. Something about her reminded him of a younger Rebecca, that youthful earnestness in her gaze. Impulsively, he pulled out his wallet and handed her a crisp $100 bill. She froze, eyes brimming with tears. "Sir, I can't. This is too much." "Please," he insisted gently. "It looks like you could use it. Consider it a tip. Maybe treat yourself to a nice dinner, or send it home if you've got family who needs it." Her hand shook as she accepted the money. "Thank you, Mr. Ward. My name's Caroline Evans. I owe you more than you know." For a moment, Alexander felt a subtle warmth in his chest, like he'd done something that might actually matter, even if just a little. Then his phone buzzed again, reminding him he was late for an appointment. With a final nod, he left Caroline behind, never imagining that less than 24 hours later he would see her again in the most unimaginable place. That evening, Alexander had an important fundraising gala to attend. Hosted by local philanthropist Dr. Anthony Farnworth at the Park Hyatt Ballroom, the event aimed to gather donations for families facing medical crises. The room glittered with wealthy investors, Hollywood celebrities, and socialites. Alexander was used to these gatherings. After all, they provided networking opportunities and put his philanthropic face on public display. Still, his mind drifted repeatedly. He thought about Caroline Evans, the young maid at the Ritz-Carlton. Her astonished eyes upon receiving that $100 haunted him in a strange way. It had been a simple gesture, something well within his means, yet the gratitude on her face seemed outsized, as though his gesture had rescued her from the brink. Was it guilt he felt? Or was it a sense of responsibility, remembering how, years ago, he'd once struggled financially himself? Throughout the gala, acquaintances came by to greet him, discussing upcoming business ventures and political news. A small circle formed around Alexander, wanting his insights on real estate trends. Yet he drifted in and out of the conversation, struggling to focus. He recalled the day he and Rebecca would fantasize about philanthropic endeavors, talking about building homes for the homeless or funding youth education in impoverished areas. Had she been alive, maybe they would have attended events like this together, standing side by side as unstoppable partners. It was well past midnight when Alexander left the gala. The entire ride back to his penthouse, he stared out the window, the city lights mirroring his mood, bright yet distant. Once inside, he placed the sealed envelope on his bedside table again, a letter he had written for Rebecca's upcoming anniversary. He slept restlessly, plagued by fitful dreams. In one, he saw Rebecca walking through the halls of a grand hotel, her dark hair flowing behind her. She was smiling, calling his name, urging him to follow. But as Alexander reached for her hand, she vanished behind a door. He opened it, only to find the same haunting scene. A graveyard with her tombstone rising cold and silent in the moonlight. His heart pounded, threatening to wake him from the nightmare. But he pressed on, searching for any sign of her. In the dream's haze, another figure emerged, a young woman with tear-streaked cheeks kneeling at the grave. She lifted her face, and Alexander recognized her, Caroline Evans, the maid. She stared at him with sorrowful eyes, then mouthed words he couldn't hear. The dream crumbled, plunging Alexander into darkness. He woke up, drenched in sweat. The digital clock glowed 4:15 a.m. The city outside was still, blanketed by the hush of early morning. Alexander didn't fall asleep again. Instead, he made himself a strong espresso, changed into workout clothes, and went to the building's private gym to clear his mind with an intense routine of weights and treadmill. By 7 a.m., he was showered and dressed in a crisp suit, deciding he would visit Rebecca's grave first thing that morning. It was earlier than he usually did, but something tugged at him from that nightmare, an urgency he couldn't ignore. The drive to the cemetery took 40 minutes, cutting through winding roads lined with old oak trees and wrought-iron fences. The sun rose behind a veil of pale clouds. On any other day, Alexander would have found some semblance of calm in that morning glow, yet today anxiety gnawed at him. He arrived at the cemetery's entrance, a modest, peaceful place set against rolling hills of emerald grass. As Alexander parked, he realized another car was already there, a worn blue sedan with a missing hubcap. It was the kind of vehicle that had clearly seen better days, and it stood out in stark contrast to his glossy black Mercedes SUV. Curious, he stepped out, letter in hand. As he made his way among the headstones, a cool breeze stirred the leaves. Finally, he reached the small marble marker that read Rebecca Holloway, 1985-2010, forever in our hearts. Someone had recently laid white lilies there, a type of flower Rebecca once told him symbolized purity and a new beginning. He frowned, recognizing these were fresh, and he hadn't placed them there. His pulse quickened when he noticed a slender figure kneeling before the grave. A woman wearing a simple black coat and scuffed shoes. She was dabbing her cheeks with a tissue. Alexander felt his breath catch. From behind, he recognized those same features, Caroline Evans, the maid he had given $100 to the previous day. His first thought was that this was some cruel extension of his dream, but no, this was real. His mind buzzed with questions. Why would Caroline be at Rebecca's grave? Did she know her somehow? She seemed startled when she sensed Alexander behind her. She turned abruptly, eyes widening in disbelief. "Mr. Ward," she whispered, voice trembling. Alexander's chest tightened. "Caroline, what are you doing here?" Her gaze dropped to the gravestone, then back to him. I should be asking you the same question," she said, looking dazed. "You knew Rebecca?" In that moment, a harsh wind blew, scattering a few petals from the lilies. Alexander's heart thundered in his ribcage. How could Caroline Evans, a hotel maid he'd only just met, possibly be here, at the final resting place of the only woman he'd ever truly loved? The morning sun glinted against the glossy surface of Rebecca's tombstone. It felt as if the entire world paused, waiting for an explanation that neither Alexander nor Caroline seemed prepared to give. Alexander knelt beside Rebecca's grave, the letter clutched tightly in his hand. Caroline stood a short distance away, her posture uneasy, as though she were contemplating whether to run or stay. Birds fluttered in nearby tree branches, their songs incongruent with the heavy silence between the two strangers who suddenly found themselves bound by a moment of inexplicable synchronicity. He set the letter next to the lilies, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Rebecca was someone very dear to me," he began, hardly daring to give voice to the memories that lurked behind his eyes. "We planned to get married once, 15 years ago." Caroline's eyes widened. "Married? But—" She trailed off, lips pursed as if holding back a torrent of words. Alexander turned to her, noticing her trembling hands. "Why are you here, Caroline?" he asked, his tone gentler than before. She hesitated, hugging her arms around herself. "I grew up in a small town in Oregon. My mother and I never had an easy life, but she always spoke of a friend she had once, someone named Rebecca Holloway. They met under unusual circumstances, but my mother considered her a kind of guardian angel, someone who showed her immense kindness. Mom used to say that if life ever became too difficult for me and we ended up in Los Angeles, I should pay respects to Rebecca and... She swallowed hard, seemingly grappling with how to continue. Alexander listened, confusion swirling in his mind. Are you saying your mother was close to Rebecca? I never even knew she'd lived in Oregon. Caroline bit her lip. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure how they knew each other. My mother never detailed it. She only told me that Rebecca's life was cut short and that it was important to remember her. A sad smile flickered across her face. When I moved to LA to find work, I remembered what my mother said. I looked up her name in an online obituary archive and found this cemetery. I started coming here once in a while, leaving flowers. Alexander tried to quell the rush of questions. Have you been coming here regularly? She nodded. Since I started working at the Ritz-Carlton about 6 months ago, whenever I can save enough money, I buy lilies. The mention of lilies jolted Alexander's memory. Rebecca always loved lilies. She once said that if she had a daughter, she'd name her Lily, but that dream never came to pass. He ran a hand through his hair, feeling an old ache stir. I appreciate what you've done, honoring Rebecca. But I still don't understand the connection between her and your mother. Do you know your mother's maiden name or any detail that could confirm how they met? Caroline shook her head. My mother rarely spoke of the past. She was protective about it, almost secretive. I only know her name was Hannah Evans. She passed away last year from cancer. If she were here, maybe she could explain. They both fell into a contemplative hush, each lost in swirling thoughts. Alexander studied Caroline, noticing for the first time the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the slight hollowness of her cheeks. She looked like someone who had battled more hardship than she let on. Guilt crept over him as he recalled giving her 100 talents. He had tossed her a sum that meant next to nothing for a billionaire, yet might have been her lifeline for a week. And now, to find her at Rebecca's grave. It felt as though the universe was rearranging puzzle pieces in front of him, urging him to see the bigger picture. Caroline glanced at the letter. You wrote her something? She asked softly. Alexander gave a faint nod. Yes, it's a tradition. Every year, I write Rebecca a letter and leave it here. I guess it's my way of talking to her, telling her what's happened in my life, even if she can't respond. Tears welled in Caroline's eyes. That's beautiful. My mother used to do the same at my father's grave. She said it was the only way to speak to someone taken too soon. A spark of shared pain lit between them. Though she was nearly half his age, they connected for an instant in understanding loss. In a moment of empathy, Alexander rested a hand gently on Caroline's shoulder. Caroline, he said, his voice trembling with sincerity, I'd like to learn more about how your mother knew Rebecca. If that's all right with you, maybe we can talk or... Her phone vibrated in her coat pocket, causing her to jump. She looked at it, eyes widening. I'm sorry. That's my supervisor at work. I'm late for my shift. Alexander gave a small, sad smile. Go. We'll talk again soon. He pulled out a business card from the inner pocket of his suit jacket. Call me when you're free. We'll meet, share stories. I want to help if I can. Caroline took the card, her hands still shaking. Thank you, Mr. Ward. I promise I'll be in touch. She hurried off, leaving Alexander alone by the grave. The morning sun climbed higher, illuminating the tombstone and the lilies with a golden glow. Alexander exhaled, feeling that old knot of grief tighten and release in the same breath. He still had so many questions about Rebecca's final years, questions he'd always assumed had no answers. But now, a maid with a gentle soul and an unexpected link to Rebecca had just stepped into his life. He pressed a palm against the cool marble of Rebecca's stone. Are you trying to tell me something? He murmured, to the memory of the woman he loved. Then he rose to leave, uncertain but strangely hopeful that the next step in his journey to heal and to understand was just beginning. That same afternoon, Alexander couldn't focus on anything else. He cancelled a lunch meeting with potential investors to replay the morning's events in his mind, trying to connect the dots. He closed himself in his office at Ward Enterprises, gazing blankly at the cityscape through tinted windows. He pulled out an old journal, leather-bound, edges frayed, that he had kept during his college years. It had been tucked away in a drawer for ages. Within its pages, he hoped to find some mention of Hannah Evans or anything that might illuminate Rebecca's hidden connections. His smartphone buzzed. Catherine Morgan's name flashed on the screen. With a sigh, he answered, "Yes, Catherine." "Sir, I just wanted to remind you of the investor dinner tonight. Are you still planning on attending?" Alexander rubbed his temples. "Yes, I'll be there. But hold all other calls for now, please. I'm not to be disturbed." He placed the phone aside, flipping through the journal's yellowed pages. Crumpled photos and scribbles of half-formed business ideas filled the margins. Random notes of private jokes, dinners, and weekend outings with Rebecca crowded entire sections. He scanned for any mention of an Evans, someone who might have crossed Rebecca's path. The recollections were bittersweet. Scribbled hearts next to Rebecca's name, details about her upcoming jazz performances, sketches of their dream home in the Berkeley Hills. Then, near the back, he found a brief passage he'd written during a tumultuous period after Rebecca had gone missing, but before he learned of her fate. July 10th. Another day searching. Talked to some of her classmates in architecture. One of them said they heard about trouble at home. Another claimed she'd met a woman named Hannah, someone from the West Coast, older, possibly a family friend. No details. I'm desperate for leads. Alexander's heart pounded. He'd completely forgotten that entry. He turned the page, searching for more. But there was nothing more about Hannah, only a note about hiring a private detective, which led to one dead end after another. So Hannah Evans was someone in Rebecca's orbit. The mere mention of her name validated Caroline's story, bridging the gap between the two women's lives. Alexander wondered if Hannah Evans had offered Rebecca refuge when she'd fled. Perhaps that was how she ended up in Oregon. If so, that meant Rebecca's last days might have been spent far away from the city, in a place no one thought to search thoroughly. That line of thinking only deepened his sense of guilt. He had spent thousands of dollars scouring leads, but apparently never looked hard enough in the right direction. Was it possible that Hannah Evans had known something about what really happened to Rebecca? He slammed the journal shut, the weight of renewed questions pressing on him. The memory of Caroline at Rebecca's grave, the lilies swaying in the breeze, kept replaying in a loop. A knock on the door startled him. Catherine's voice sounded softly from the other side. "Mr. Ward? Are you sure you don't want to eat lunch? The kitchen staff prepared your usual meal." His stomach churned with anxiety, not hunger, but he forced himself to respond civilly. "I'm fine, Catherine. Please I need a moment." The footsteps retreated. Alexander leaned back in his chair, letting his eyes drift shut. He remembered the promise Caroline had made to call him. Would she follow through? He had seen sincerity in her gaze. She didn't strike him as someone out to manipulate his wealth or exploit his vulnerabilities. Then again, he was no stranger to deception. Over the years, opportunists had come knocking, claiming false connections to Rebecca or brandishing forged evidence of her final days, hoping to profit from his desperation for closure. He'd learned to be cautious. Still, something about Caroline felt genuine. He made up his mind. If Caroline didn't call soon, he'd find a reason to see her at the Ritz-Carlton. He had to know more, not just for his own peace of mind, but because it felt like a final chapter of Rebecca's story was waiting to be told. Alexander exhaled, the tension in his shoulders refusing to ease. For 15 years, he had navigated life with a numb acceptance that he might never understand the complete truth. But now, for the first time in a long while, there was a flicker of hope. Maybe he was on the verge of discovering what really happened to the woman who once lit his life with love and possibility. With renewed resolve he stood, straightened his suit jacket, and mentally prepared himself for the evening's investor dinner, another ritual of social niceties where he'd have to plaster on a smile and feign normalcy. But beneath that polished facade, the real Alexander Ward was unraveling, inch by inch, desperate to find answers to a past that refused to stay buried. Late that night, well after the investor dinner concluded, Alexander's phone buzzed. He'd just returned to his penthouse, still in his tux, tie undone around his neck, mind whirling with the usual corporate pleasantries. With a sense of urgency, he swiped to answer. "Hello?" A tentative voice greeted him. "Mr. Ward, it's Caroline Evans." A wave of relief washed over him. "Caroline, thank you for calling. I wasn't sure I'd hear from you." He heard a nervous laugh on the other end. "I'm sorry it took so long. I just finished my shift, and there's a coffee shop near the hotel that's open late. Can we meet? I think we should talk." Alexander didn't hesitate. "Absolutely. Text me the address, and I'll be there." Within minutes, his driver navigated him through quiet, nighttime streets to a modest cafe. The neon sign blinked overhead, casting a soft pink glow onto the sidewalk. Inside, the ambience was cozy, with only a few patrons spaced out among small tables. Caroline sat in a corner booth looking apprehensive. He approached, suddenly conscious of how out of place he might seem in his formal attire. As he slid into the seat across from her, Caroline offered a shy smile. "Sorry, I didn't realize you'd come straight from an event," she said. Alexander waved off the concern. "Don't worry about that. I'm glad we're meeting." He paused, studying her face. "How have you been? You seemed pretty shaken earlier today." Caroline wrapped her hands around a paper cup of steaming tea. "I'm all right. It's just, when I saw you at the grave, I was so surprised. My mother never told me about the men in Rebecca's life. I didn't know she was engaged, if that's what you meant earlier." Alexander nodded, searching her expression. "We weren't officially engaged, but we planned a life together." His voice softened. "I'd like to know more about your mother, Hannah Evans. I found an old journal entry from years ago mentioning her name in connection to Rebecca. Do you know how they met?" Caroline inhaled a shaky breath, staring down at her tea. "She told me bits and pieces. It was after college, I think. Mom was dealing with some legal trouble. Her ex-husband had left her with debts. She ran into Rebecca at a small diner. Rebecca apparently paid for Mom's meal because she saw how desperate she looked. They struck up a conversation and, well, eventually, Rebecca let Mom stay at her place for a few weeks." Alexander's chest tightened. Rebecca used to do that, help people without second thought. "Do you know where this place was?" Caroline shook her head. "All I know is that it was near Big Sur. That's where we lived for a while when I was a kid, before we moved to Oregon. Big Sur." The mention of that place made Alexander's stomach twist. That was the area where they discovered Rebecca's body 5 years after she went missing, though the authorities had been unsure how she'd ended up there. He leaned forward, heart pounding. "Caroline, do you think your mother might have known anything about what happened to Rebecca?" Her voice was thick with emotion. "I wish I knew. Mom never told me details. Whenever I pressed her, she'd shut down or say it wasn't my business, but she did mention that Rebecca was running from someone." Alexander's mind whirled with possibilities. Running from who? Her family? The father who disapproved of her career? Or a more sinister threat? He recalled that at the time, rumors circulated that Rebecca had gotten tangled with a suspicious figure, someone who might have threatened her or forced her to vanish. He sighed, trying to piece it all together. "This is all very overwhelming, but thank you for telling me. I know it's not easy for you either." Caroline reached into her bag, pulling out a worn photograph. "I thought you might want to see this." She handed it to Alexander. His breath caught in his throat when he recognized Rebecca's radiant face in the picture. She stood beside a second woman, presumably Hannah Evans, both smiling as if the weight of the world had lifted from their shoulders. The picture's background was a cozy wooden cabin, sunlight filtering through redwood trees. "Mom kept this in her diary," Caroline explained. "It's dated July 14th, 2010. Rebecca disappeared that same month, didn't she?" Alexander's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Yes," he whispered. "So she was alive long enough to take this photo with Hannah. But then something terrible happened." Caroline hesitated, her expression pained. "I'm sorry you have to see this now, but I figure maybe it can help you get answers, closure." He gently placed the photograph on the table, taking a moment to steel himself. "Caroline, if there's anything else you remember, any letter your mother left, any clue, please let me know. This means more to me than you realize." Caroline gazed at him, eyes filled with compassion. "Of course, I'll help however I can, Mr. Ward." They lingered a while longer, exchanging what scant information they had. Caroline recounted memories of her mother talking about Rebecca's unwavering kindness. Alexander shared how he and Rebecca had dreamed of traveling the world, building a life free from constraints. At last, the waitress approached, politely letting them know the cafe would be closing soon. Outside, the air was crisp. Alexander offered to give Caroline a ride home, but she declined, saying she lived only 2 blocks away. Before parting, he slipped a small envelope into her hand. "There's a phone inside you can use. A simple one, separate from your own if you need privacy. My number is on speed dial. Don't hesitate to call me if you recall anything else." Caroline thanked him, tears in her eyes again, and walked off into the night. Alexander watched her go, clutching the photograph of Rebecca and Hannah. He felt as though a locked door in his heart had cracked open, flooding him with a tumult of hope, sadness, and the burning need for truth. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Between managing the finalization of a luxury resort project in Hawaii and overseeing philanthropic endeavors in Los Angeles, Alexander carved out time to search for more leads. He reached out to local authorities in Big Sur, asking for case files on Rebecca's disappearance that might now be declassified. He hired a new private investigator, Martina Briggs, someone with an impeccable track record for digging up hidden truths. Caroline and Alexander kept sporadic contact. She'd used the phone he gave her to relay small discoveries. An old letter she found tucked inside a family Bible, her mother's scattered journal entries about the friend who saved her from despair. It was all partial pieces of a puzzle, yet each piece seemed to bring them closer to what happened all those years ago. One afternoon, Alexander's assistant, Catherine, buzzed him. "Mr. Ward, you have a visitor, Martina Briggs. Should I send her in?" "Yes, please," he replied. The private investigator strode in, a tall, no-nonsense woman with short brown hair and sharp eyes. She carried a black briefcase and wore an expression of professional detachment. Alexander motioned for her to sit. "I have preliminary findings," Martina began, setting the briefcase down. "Although official records are limited, I've managed to contact some local sources in Monterey County." Alexander leaned forward, a coil of anticipation knotting in his stomach. "Go on." Martina flipped open the case, withdrawing a thin folder. "This is the coroner's report on Rebecca Holloway from 2015. Cause of death: presumed homicide, though inconclusive. The file mentions she was discovered in a shallow grave near a hiking trail commonly used by travelers. No personal identification was found with the remains, and the case never moved beyond a few initial suspects." Alexander's heart pounded. He'd read that summary before, but hearing it aloud never grew easier. "Any leads on who those suspects might have been?" Martina nodded. "Local rumors pointed to a man named Christopher Greenwood, someone who was rumored to have been romantically involved with Mrs. Holloway after she left Berkeley. But the authorities never substantiated his existence. The name never turned up in official records." He grimaced. "I've never heard that name before. No mention of him at all in my searches." Martina continued. "There's also mention of a possible protective order filed by Ms. Holloway in Monterey County Court. Unfortunately, the record is sealed. I'm working on petitioning a judge to unseal it, but it might take time. Alexander's gaze shifted to the window. The sun was high, casting beams across his polished desk. "Keep me informed," he murmured. "Money's no object. If you need more resources, just let me know." Martina offered a curt nod, then collected her folder and exited. Left alone, Alexander felt a queasy mixture of anger, guilt, and sadness swirl within him. Rebecca might have been in danger. She might have turned to Hannah for help. Then something else, someone else, entered the picture. That evening Caroline called him, voice tinged with worry. "Mr. Ward, I've been reading my mother's diary. There's an entry from around that time, July 15th, 2010. It says something like, 'Rebecca was terrified he'd find her. We talked about leaving the country. She doesn't want to worry Alexander, but I think he's the only one who can save her now.'" Alexander froze. "That's about me." "Sounds like it," Caroline replied quietly. "I'm sorry. It looks like my mother knew Rebecca was planning to contact you, but something stopped her. She never did she?" He closed his eyes, his throat constricting. No, she didn't. I would have done anything for her. If she was afraid, she should have come to me." He drew in a shuddering breath, grappling with the flood of regret. Caroline hesitated on the line, and when she spoke again, there was a tremor in her voice. "I'm scared, Mr. Ward. What if the person who hurt Rebecca? What if they find out we're digging into this? My mother always warned me to keep quiet, but I can't. Not anymore." A surge of protectiveness rose in him. "Caroline, I won't let anything happen to you. Stay somewhere safe. If you need money, a hotel, anything, call me." She thanked him, a quiet gratitude in her tone, and they ended the call. Alexander stared at his phone, a sense of grim determination solidifying. If someone had taken Rebecca's life, they weren't going to get away with it. Not if he could help it. But he also realized this wasn't just about justice for Rebecca. It was about giving Caroline a sense of closure, a release from the shadows that her mother's secrets had cast on their lives. Together, they were unraveling a mystery 15 years in the making, one that threatened to upend everything Alexander believed about the woman he loved, and about his own past failures to protect her. A week later, things took a startling turn. Martina Briggs managed to get an expedited review of the sealed protective order. The judge, moved by certain compelling factors she presented, unsealed the document under strict confidentiality. Alexander paced his office as Martina relayed the details via a secure phone line. "I have a copy in front of me," she said. "Rebecca filed it against someone identified only by initials, CG. The petition states that CG threatened her life if she returned to Los Angeles. She feared for her safety. Mention of a Christopher Greenwood arises again, though no official last name is attached in the file." Alexander's heart hammered. "That matches the rumor we heard. So, Christopher Greenwood is real." "It seems so," Martina replied grimly. "He must have had enough influence or cunning to remain off the radar." The protective order was filed in Monterey County on July 12, 2010, only days before Rebecca's final journal entry, if we consider that photograph you have. This is the last trace of her on record before she vanished. Alexander felt the weight of the tragedy press on him anew. Rebecca had been living in terror, so much so that she'd considered running away, possibly out of the country, rather than alerting him. Why? Pride. Fear of dragging him into her mess. "What's the next step?" he asked Martina. "I'll keep investigating," she said. "We need to find any associates of Christopher Greenwood. I'll also see if there's a police report connected to that protective order. If he was real, someone somewhere must have known him." They ended the call. Alexander's mind whirled. He glanced at the photograph of Rebecca with Hannah pinned to his corkboard. Then he thought of Caroline, the unsuspecting child who grew up with secrets swirling around her home. He grabbed his jacket and decided it was time to visit Caroline in person. She lived in a modest studio apartment near the hotel, a detail she mentioned in passing. Normally, he would have given her space, but the intensifying revelations demanded immediate communication. The building was old, the elevator broken. Alexander climbed 3 flights of stairs, ignoring the curious stares from residents who recognized the wealthy mogul from television. He knocked on Caroline's door, footsteps shuffling inside. When she opened it, her eyes lit with surprise and a touch of fear. "Mr. Ward, is everything okay?" "I'm sorry for dropping by unannounced," he said, "but I have urgent news. May I come in?" Caroline nodded, stepping aside. The small apartment was tidy, if sparsely furnished. A worn couch, a second-hand coffee table, and a single window that let in the evening glow of streetlights. Photos of her late mother, Hannah, adorned a small corner shelf. Alexander sat on the couch. "Caroline, we have reason to believe Rebecca was involved with a dangerous man named Christopher Greenwood. He may have been responsible for her death. I'm worried you might be at risk if he's still out there." Caroline's face paled. "Oh God, my mother once mentioned a man named Chris. She never gave me a last name, but she said he was trouble. He'd come around the cabin where they lived, pestering Rebecca for money or something." Alexander felt a jolt. "Money? Did your mother say if Rebecca owed him anything?" Caroline shook her head. "I don't know. Mom only said that he frightened Rebecca, that he was manipulative and violent. Once he showed up uninvited, banging on the door. Mom refused to let him in. She said we left for Oregon soon after that incident." A chill skittered down Alexander's spine. "This is important. Martina, my private investigator, is digging into it. But I want you to be safe. If you sense anything suspicious, anyone following you, promise you'll tell me." Caroline nodded, voice shaky. "I will." Alexander noticed the tension in her posture, the way she wrung her hands. Without thinking, he placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure this out," he said softly. "I won't let what happened to Rebecca happen again." Tears filled her eyes. "She saved my mother's life, you know. If there's anything I can do to repay that debt, to help bring her justice, I will." They talked further, going over every detail Caroline could recall from her childhood. She remembered half-forgotten arguments, hushed phone calls, Hannah and Rebecca whispering about Alexander, how he was the one person who could truly keep Rebecca safe, but how they didn't want to drag him into their nightmare. Eventually, Alexander rose to leave, pressing some cash into Caroline's hand, despite her protests. "For security," he insisted. "Get yourself a better lock, maybe a new phone plan, anything. Just humor me." She wiped her eyes and thanked him. As he stepped out into the hallway, he realized his heart felt lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because each new piece of information brought them closer to the truth. Heavier because that truth was shaping up to be darker than he'd ever imagined. The next morning, Martina Briggs phoned with a breakthrough. "Mr. Ward, I pulled up old property records near Big Sur. There was a cabin purchased under an LLC named Greenwood Properties. It was sold about a year after Rebecca disappeared. I've located the new owner. He claims he found old letters in the attic, letters addressed to AW from someone named Rebecca. I'm driving there now. You should come." Alexander's heart thundered. Letters from Rebecca to him, never delivered. He wasted no time. Within the hour, he and Martina were weaving up the coastal highway, the majestic cliffs and roaring Pacific, as a backdrop to their urgent mission. The cabin was secluded, nestled among towering redwoods. The new owner, an older man named Harold Townsend, greeted them cautiously. After some initial skepticism, he handed over a yellowed envelope. "I found a stack of these behind a loose board," he explained. "Not sure how they got there. I was going to toss them, but something told me to keep them." Alexander's hands trembled as he opened the envelope. Inside was a letter dated July 13th, 2010. "My dearest Alexander, I don't know how to begin. Please forgive me for leaving you in the dark. I've made terrible mistakes and I'm trying to keep you safe. There's a man who threatens my life, Christopher Greenwood. I owe him everything. Money, secrets. I can't involve you. You're better off forgetting me. but I can't bear the thought of never seeing you again. If something happens, know this. I always loved you, and I'm sorry." Alexander's vision blurred with tears. Rebecca had tried to reach him, to warn him, to explain, but something or someone had stopped her from sending these letters. He sank to his knees on the worn wooden floor. Even 15 years later, her words pierced his heart with the intensity of raw, undiluted love and regret. Martina gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Are there more letters?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Harold nodded. "Yes, a few. I'll get them." Alexander stared into the shadows of the cabin's interior. This was the place she hid, the last refuge of a woman caught between love and danger. He felt a surge of determination flood through him. Christopher Greenwood, if he was indeed the orchestrator of this tragedy, would not remain hidden forever. Days turned into nights as Alexander pored through Rebecca's recovered letters, unraveling more details of her harrowing final months. In them, she described Christopher Greenwood as a ruthless manipulator who once lured her into a dubious investment scheme. When she discovered his criminal ties, she tried to cut all contact, but he demanded money, threatening to harm both her and anyone close to her if she refused. That explained why she never reached out to Alexander. She wanted to shield him from Greenwood's wrath. Armed with these letters and new evidence, Martina Briggs escalated her investigation. She traced financial records, located acquaintances, and soon uncovered a shocking twist. Christopher Greenwood was still alive, operating under various aliases in the Los Angeles underworld. He wasn't just a petty criminal, he was part of a larger network that specialized in blackmail and fraud. Within a month, the police, bolstered by Martina's findings, opened a fresh case on the presumed murder of Rebecca Holloway. An arrest warrant for Greenwood was issued. The news made local headlines, with reporters eager to connect the dots between the reopened investigation and Alexander Ward, the reclusive millionaire known to have once been romantically linked to the victim. During this tumultuous period, Alexander and Caroline's bond grew. She often stayed in a guest suite at one of Alexander's hotels, protected by discreet security personnel. They spent countless evenings discussing the new developments, reading more letters from Rebecca. Caroline's admiration for Rebecca deepened, learning how this kind-hearted woman saved her mother and ultimately gave her life protecting others. Finally, the night came when the police, acting on a tip, closed in on Greenwood's hideout in East LA. He was apprehended after a brief standoff, arrested on multiple charges, including suspicion of Rebecca's murder. Alexander stood by the phone, adrenaline surging, as Detective Morales called to relay the news. Once Greenwood was in custody, Alexander felt a burden lift. But it wasn't joy. It was more of a grim release. In a statement to the press, he said, "I am grateful to the authorities for their efforts in this case. Rebecca Holloway was an extraordinary woman who deserved a full life, free from fear and violence. My hope is that justice will finally be served." Caroline watched the press conference on a TV in Alexander's penthouse suite, tears glistening in her eyes. When he returned from the station, she threw her arms around him in a tight hug. "Thank you," she whispered, "for fighting for her, for my mother, for everything." He stroked her hair gently, voice thick with emotion. "She deserved the truth to come to light, and so did you." In the weeks that followed, Christopher Greenwood was arraigned, the evidence mounting against him. The district attorney's office built a strong case, citing the newly found letters, Hannah Evans's diary entries, and testimonies from people who'd witnessed Greenwood harass Rebecca. Caroline even found an old postcard that Rebecca had sent her mother, with Greenwood's menacing scrawl on the back, further proof of his intimidation tactics. The tension eased from Alexander's life little by little. For the first time in 15 years, he felt the possibility of closure. One crisp afternoon, he asked Caroline to accompany him to Rebecca's grave. They stood together, both carrying white lilies. Birds sang in the nearby trees, and a gentle breeze caressed their faces. Alexander placed the lilies on the stone. "Rebecca," he said softly, I found your letters. I know why you left. I'm sorry I wasn't there to protect you, but I promise your story won't be forgotten." Caroline placed her own flowers beside his. "I wish I could have met you," she murmured, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Thank you for helping my mom. Without you, I wouldn't be here." They stood in silence for a long moment, letting the weight of history settle. Then Alexander reached into his pocket, pulling out a small wooden box. "There's something I want you to have," he told Caroline. "I had it made for Rebecca years ago, an engagement ring. I was planning to propose after graduation, but, well, life had other plans." Caroline's eyes widened. I can't take that. It's too precious." Alexander opened the box, revealing a simple yet elegant diamond ring. "I want you to keep it safe. Let it remind you of the bravery Rebecca showed and of all the good she did. You and your mother were a part of her final story." Trembling, Caroline lifted the ring. Her gaze shifted between Alexander and the grave. "I'm honored," she whispered. "Truly." A month later, Greenwood's trial began in a packed Los Angeles courtroom. The media swirled around, hungry for every detail. Alexander and Caroline attended the sessions, hearing the damning testimonies that confirmed Greenwood's manipulative tactics and violent threats. The letters from Rebecca, expertly authenticated, became the linchpin of the prosecution's case. After days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. Greenwood's sentencing would follow, but the collective sense of relief in the courtroom was palpable. Outside, cameras flashed as Alexander and Caroline left arm in arm. Microphones were thrust toward them, questions about how they felt. Alexander cleared his throat, addressing the sea of reporters. "I'm grateful that justice has been served. It doesn't bring Rebecca back, but it honors her memory. She deserved better." Caroline added, voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "I hope this brings peace to everyone hurt by Greenwood's actions. Rebecca Holloway was a beautiful soul who stood up for what was right, even if it cost her everything." In the days that followed the verdict, Alexander found himself in an uncharted emotional territory. For so long, his life's narrative was tinged with the tragedy of Rebecca's disappearance. Now a semblance of resolution had arrived, leaving him free to contemplate the future rather than remain anchored in the past. Strangely enough, it was Caroline who became a beacon of sorts, a reminder that from heartbreak and sorrow, new bonds could form, new purposes found. She decided to enroll in community college, fueled by the desire to become a social worker or counselor, helping women escaping violence and abusive relationships, just as Rebecca helped her mother. Alexander offered to pay her tuition, not as a benefactor bestowing charity, but as someone who recognized a kindred spirit. He saw in Caroline the determination and kindness that once drew him to Rebecca. In doing so, he found a path to honor Rebecca's legacy by supporting someone who carried forward that same spirit of compassion. When the next anniversary of Rebecca's passing arrived, Alexander and Caroline returned to the cemetery with fresh lilies, joined by a handful of close friends. They each spoke a few words in remembrance. No longer did the day feel like a wound torn open. It felt more like the gentle ache of a scar, a reminder of loss, yet also a testament to survival and hope. As they left the grave, Caroline linked her arm through Alexander's. "We did it," she said quietly. "We found justice for her." He nodded, exhaling a breath that felt decades overdue. "Thank you for not giving up. You helped me uncover a truth I was afraid I'd never find." They walked away under the glow of the afternoon sun, the last echoes of a painful chapter finally laid to rest. In its place, an unwritten future stretched out before them, a testament that love once sowed can endure even after unspeakable tragedy. 15 years of heartbreak and mystery finally found resolution when Alexander Ward and Caroline Evans joined forces to uncover the truth behind Rebecca Holloway's tragic fate. Their journey braved old secrets, dangerous threats, and emotional revelations, but it also proved that kindness and determination can triumph over even the darkest forces. With Christopher Greenwood behind bars, the memory of Rebecca's selflessness lives on, inspiring Caroline to pursue a path where she can help others, just as Rebecca helped her mother. And for Alexander, the guilt and sorrow that once haunted him have begun to transform into hope and purpose. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If you were moved by this story, please hit the like button, share it with friends, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss our upcoming real-life and romantic drama stories. Your support helps us bring more compelling tales straight to you. Stay tuned for the next chapter of heartfelt storytelling.